So this video is the continuation of female reproductive system. We're looking at reproductive physiology. So the main thrust of female reproductive physiology is the production of the gametes, of the eggs, as it were. Now, this is an ongoing thing. It starts out fetally. So there are cells that start into the meiosis in female fetuses before birth. Unlike spermatogenesis, which happens in adult males, this is all prenatally. There are stem cells called the oogonia, and the oogonia are diploid cells, and they multiply by mitosis, and they have cytoplasm, and they store nutrients. Now, these will then, some of them, or a lot of them, end up starting meiosis. And they get stalled in meiosis in prophase 1, right at the beginning of prophase 1. So this is when the chromosomes condense and the nuclear envelope is disappearing. The chromosomes aren't even lined up yet. These are still diploid cells. They will stay this way until they are stimulated properly, and so they may be 45 or 50 years later that they complete meiosis. So when they're stalled in this prophase 1, they are called primary oocytes, and they live in the primordial follicles in the ovary. So after the cycle begins, after puberty begins, because of hormonal reasons, which we will talk about shortly, a few of these primary oocytes become activated. The follicles, the primordial follicles, become stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone. And they grow. It becomes a race to see which one gets to kind of resume meiosis 1. When at the end of meiosis 1, you now have 2 haploid cells, 2 haploid nuclei. Now, one of the nuclei steals all of the cytoplasm, all of the mitochondria, all of the cytoplasm stays with the one nucleus. And this is called the secondary oocyte. It is a haploid cell. The other nucleus is ejected. It leaves the cytoplasm, often stays stuck to the outside of the secondary oocyte, and we call this nucleus the first polar body. It is basically wasted. It's not going to be used. So the secondary oocyte then stops in metaphase 2. So the chromosomes line up along the center line to be separated. The sister chromatids are going to separate, and it gets stuck there. So this secondary oocyte will then be the thing that is ovulated, stuck in the metaphase 2 of meiosis. Now, if that secondary oocyte meets a sperm, the sperm will enter the secondary oocyte. It is now called an ovum. it quickly completes meiosis 2. So now it ends up with 2 nuclei that are still haploid, but the sister chromatids separate. One of these is ejected as the second polar body, and the other one will merge with the nuclear material from the sperm to make the new person. So that's the point of conception. So it's the second polar body. Now, if the first polar body is still stuck to the outside of this oocyte, the secondary oocyte, the local chemical hormones that cause the completing of meiosis 2 will happen in the first polar body as well, and it will complete meiosis 2 and divide, so that we end up with 3 nuclei from polar bodies that don't get used, and the one in the ovum that does get used. So meiosis starts at prenatally and finishes that round of meiosis whenever that oocyte gets fertilized. If the oocyte's not fertilized, it stays stuck in metaphase 2, ends up in the uterus, and then is lost with menstruation. Nothing happens, and it doesn't complete the meiosis 2. So the oogonium here undergoes mitosis, makes more oogonia. They grow, and through infancy and childhood, they are arrested here in prophase 1. Then every cycle, some of them undergo the rest of meiosis 1, kick out the polar body, the first polar body, and then get stuck in metaphase 2. A sperm enters, which completes the metaphase 2. The second polar body is ejected, leaving the nucleus and all the cytoplasm with the ova. And like I say, if the first polar body is still in the vicinity, it will complete, and these 3 polar bodies all just degenerate. They all just fall apart. Now, the timing of this is all in primordial follicles, with the follicular cells, little squamous cells surrounding each one. The follicle-stimulating hormone makes the primordial follicle become a primary follicle and a secondary follicle, and it starts producing estrogen, which then causes this to happen. This first polar body is ejected at about the time that it's a vesicular follicle, a Graafian follicle. At the time of ovulation, it is stuck here in metaphase 2. We end up with a corpus luteum and progesterone that keeps this thing alive until the sperm enters, and then it completes. So remember that the ovary and the uterus are 2 separate organs that come from 2 separate places that, they have to coordinate their actions, and they each have a cycle. So there's an ovarian cycle and there's a menstrual cycle. And they have to coordinate. It is monthly. Menos means monthly. Moon. So it happens to be usually about 28 days. Now, if it's not 28 days, that's okay, but that's kind of the average. The first 14 days is called the follicular phase, because it is under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, and the follicles are what's growing. The oocyte is completing meiosis 1, starting into meiosis 2. The follicle cells are producing all kinds of estrogen. Right? And then we're going to see what the pituitary gland does in a couple of minutes. But it will spark ovulation. Now, ovulation doesn't take very long. It's a fraction of a second. Some women feel it. It's called Schmerz. If you feel it, you'll feel a little pang of sharp pain for a second or so. Other women are not aware of it. Then the ovary enters what's called the luteal phase, because now there's a corpus luteum. And this lasts for 14 days in the second half of the cycle. Now, the follicular phase may vary. The luteal phase generally stays 14 days. So, in the follicular phase, the primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle because it's activated. The squamous cells that the follicular cells grow, become cuboidal. It becomes the primary follicle. And it looks like this. There is a primordial follicle. There is a primary follicle. It's being stimulated. This is a close-up of the primary follicle growing. This is the oocyte, and you can see that the chromosomes are condensed in here. It's not chromatin. These cells are starting to produce some estrogen, so estrogen levels are going up. The primary follicle then becomes a secondary follicle. These follicular cells now stratify, and they're called granulosa cells. And the granulosa cells guide the oocyte's development, and the oocyte's development affects the granulosa cells, so they work in tandem. The secondary follicle becomes a late secondary follicle as there's fluid starts to accumulate around the oocyte itself. Is called the zona pellucida. There is a theca folliculi making lots and lots of estrogen because there are so many cells. So if we look at this is a secondary follicle, and you see that the follicle cells have now started to reproduce and are found in a couple of layers. It's starting to stratify up. This is still the oocyte in the center. You can see now fluid starting to accumulate. So this is the beginning of the late secondary follicle. All kinds of granulosa cells here. So the amount of estrogen is going way up. Oh, I don't know what happened there. So the late secondary follicle becomes vesicular. A vesicle is a fluid-filled sac. So the vesicular follicle is very fluid-filled, and there's an antrum. And it expands, and it isolates the oocyte onto a stalk. The vesicle bulges out of the surface of the ovary, and meiosis 1 is completed at this point. Ovulation happens, the wall ruptures, the secondary oocyte leaves, along with the corona radiata, and then you might get Schmerz. Usually what happens at the time of this ovulation is that it inhibits any other follicles that are close, they don't ovulate. Sometimes there's more than one actually ovulates because it's too close together, and if both oocytes are fertilized, then you can get fraternal twins, two separate oocytes, as opposed to identical twins, which come from one fertilized oocyte, one ova. So this is a vesicular follicle. See how much fluid is in it? All of these follicular cells are pumping out all kinds of estrogen. The oocyte is surrounded by this, and it's only just attached by this little stalk. This is the follicle rupturing. I don't know why it looks like lava here. It's the lighting, obviously, of the photograph, but that is the moment of ovulation. And then we end up in the luteal phase. So the ruptured follicle collapses because all the liquid has left. All these granulosa cells form the corpus luteum, which starts secreting progesterone along with the estrogen. If there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum breaks down into the corpus albicans in about a week and a half, in about 10 days. If there is pregnancy, the corpus luteum produces hormones until the placenta can take over. So this is the formation of the corpus luteum. This is a photograph of that. So during childhood, what happens here is that what causes the release of gonadotropins, FSH and LH, from the pituitary gland, what controls that is, if you remember from the endocrine system, is a hypothalamus hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. And the gonadotropin releasing hormone is inhibited by a little bit of estrogen that is made during childhood. So that little bit of estrogen is made by these childhood ovaries that are not ready yet. They inhibit this release, and they cause growth and like normal maturation of the child. As puberty gets close, the gonadotropin releasing hormone is released, which then causes FSH and LH to be released by the pituitary. And these target the ovaries. The receptors are in the ovaries. And it takes a little bit, but after about a year of this, we reach menarche, and had a cyclical pattern emerges. So this estrogen inhibits the gonadotropin releasing hormone for a short period. At puberty, the adult pattern is achieved. So if we assume a 28-day cycle, we can say that at the beginning of day 1, there's a gonadotropin releasing hormone that releases follicle stimulating hormone and a little bit of LH. These hormones target the follicular cells in the ovaries, and they cause the growth of several follicles. And that, in turn, causes estrogen release. As the estrogen levels go up, estrogen inhibits gonadotropin releasing hormone. So FSH and LH release is inhibited, not the making of it. But so what happens is the FSH and LH are synthesized and then stored. The estrogen levels also enhance further estrogen output because the estrogen causes the follicular cells to grow and turn into granulosa cells and multiply, which then increases estrogen levels, which in turn keeps the whole thing going. So the estrogen levels go up and up and up until it reaches a threshold. And when estrogen levels get high enough, it actually has a positive feedback effect on the pituitary. And all of a sudden, there's a surge of luteinizing hormone, and to a lesser extent, follicle-stimulating hormone, on day 14, if we're assuming a 28-day cycle, so halfway through. This huge surge of LH causes the completion of meiosis, so the secondary completion of meiosis 1. Secondary oocyte goes to metaphase 2, and it triggers ovulation. And then it causes the ruptured cells that were granulosa cells to become the corpus luteum. That's why it's called luteinizing hormone. So it's really responsible for ovulation and then the creation of more hormones. In men, follicle-stimulating hormone is about making testosterone, but it's mostly about making sperm. It's the cause of spermatogenesis. Luteinizing hormone in men causes testosterone. So in both sexes, luteinizing hormone is about making hormones, sex hormones, and follicle-stimulating hormone is mostly about making gametes. So the corpus luteum produces inhibin, progesterone, and estrogen. The inhibin inhibits FSH and LH release. Right? The declining FSH and LH ends the luteal activity, the corpus luteum, and inhibits follicular development because the follicle-stimulating hormone isn't there. So it turns that off. At right near the end of day 27, day 28, the corpus luteum dies, turns into the corpus albicans, and stops inhibiting the FSH and LH. The estrogen levels go down, which ends the blockade of FSH and LH. As progesterone levels go down, hence the blockade of FSH and LH. So FSH and LH are released, which stimulates some more primordial follicles to become primary follicles, and the whole thing starts again. So if we look at it here, gonadotropin releasing hormone causes FSH and LH to target the follicular cells, and then are inhibited by the inhibin and etc. And you can just follow this whole thing along, but it basically is the same thing. So if we look at the hormone level concentrations, starting here, day 1, FSH and LH levels stay moderate. It stimulates. The estrogen starts getting produced, which inhibits. So FSH levels go down as the estrogen levels are going up. And then all of a sudden at day 14, there's a spike in LH and FSH release, not a spike in production, which then quickly drops off because it's all released, which causes ovulation and the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then inhibits LH and FSH, so these both of them drop. At this point, it starts again, and it starts to rise again, and so that's the cycle of FSH and LH. Primary follicle becomes secondary, becomes vesicular, ovulation, the corpus luteum, corpus albicans. And you'll notice the colors are the same here and here. So you can put those two things together. Now, meantime, over in the uterus, there's a menstrual cycle. And this is cyclical changes in the endometrium. So there's three phases of this. There's the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. So the menstrual phase is days 1 through 5. Now it might be 4, it might be, might be 6. It varies a little bit. This is when the endometrial lining is sloughed off and bleeding occurs. The new stratum functionalis starts to grow as soon as menstrual phase ends, so someplace around day 6. And it grows and grows and grows. It proliferates, so we call this the proliferative phase. And this is before ovulation. So it coincides with the pre-ovulatory time of the ovaries. Ovulation happens at day 14, and then day 15 to 28 is the secretory phase. And this is when the endometrium is secreting nutrients and things that are going to keep sperm alive and healthy and oocytes alive and healthy, leading to implantation. This is a constant 14-day length. This pre-ovulatory phases, the two of them, can vary, but the secretory phase, pretty constant at 14 days. So the menstrual phase, the ovarian hormones are at their lowest. So it's the lowest amount of estrogen, the lowest amount of progesterone. The gonadotropin, so this is the FSH and LH, are beginning to rise. The structure functionalis is shed, and you have the menstrual flow. In the proliferative phase, the estrogen levels start to go up. So that causes the endometrial cells to start to proliferate, and you will grow a new stratum functionalis. And you will also grow progesterone receptors here. The glands enlarge, the spiral arteries grow, etc. The secretory phase happens after ovulation. So now during the luteal phase of the ovary, now we have progesterone, progestation for pregnancy, preparing for pregnancy. Progesterone levels cause further development of the endometrium, secretion of glycogen, and the cervical mucus plug happens because of this. So if we look at this same cycle, estrogen levels and progesterone levels are very low. This is about the time that the FSH is going up. We end up with estrogens being produced, which are inhibiting the FSH, and estrogen levels go way up, up, until it reaches the threshold. When that threshold, they no longer inhibit. LH and FSH are released, causing the corpus luteum, which makes the progesterone levels go way up really quickly. Estrogen levels first drop because they've lost some cells, but then estrogen levels go up. And then as the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, progesterone levels drop dramatically, estrogen levels also drop dramatically, and this is when menstruation starts. So you put this together. Menstrual, then proliferative, ovulation, secretory, menstrual. So if there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates to the corpus albicans, progesterone levels fall, spiral arteries kink, they go into spasm, then the spiral arteries relax, open wide, you get a rush of blood, the functional layer, the stratum functionalis, comes off. So the estrogen level promotes oogenesis, the follicular growth in the ovary. So it causes the oocyte to move from prophase 1 to finish prophase 1, to finish meiosis 1. Its anabolic effects on the female reproductive tract, so the secondary female characteristics, and a rapid growth spurt at puberty. This is why all the class pictures of grade 8 classes, all the back row is the girls and the front row is the boys, and by the time they get to grade 10, it's the other way around. So the growth of breasts, increased subcutaneous fat, changes in the pelvis. Right? It maintains cholesterol, facilitates calcium uptake, causes bone growth. So it's important. Progesterone is for gestation. So it inhibits uterine motility, prepares the breast for lactation. This is why in the second half of your cycle, even if you're not pregnant, a lot of women report that their breasts are very tender or very sensitive. It's because progesterone targets breasts. So the female sexual response, it's as much psychological as anything. When there's excitement, the clitoris, the vaginal mucosa, and the breasts all engorge with blood. The vestibular glands secrete, so that's the Bartholin glands, so it lubricates the vestibule. And if everything goes right, it ends in orgasm and a rhythmic contraction of the uterus and a big release of oxytocin. There's no refractory period, so another orgasm can happen right away. Now, orgasm isn't necessary for conception, although apparently it's nice.